an IP strategy for small startup-like companies. In this podcast, we'll cover 6 key aspects of intellectual property management for small businesses. First, we'll debunk some of the objections and myths. We'll demonstrate how to look and operate in a sophisticated way. We'll be discussing the perception of value in IP and how it enhances business valuation. We'll talk about how to explore IP that can attract and reassure investors. We'll talk about leveraging IP and how it can help with customer relationships or competitive advantage. And we'll understand IP's roles and other various business functions. So this podcast should equip you with actionable insights to effectively manage IP, protecting your assets, and foster business growth. This is John Cronin from Invent Anything.
Inventions keep the world spinning. From fire in the wheel to today's high tech, inventions power change. Turn your inventions into reality. Learn how to get your ideas to market. This is Invent Anything with John Cronin.
Today we will cover 6 topics. The first is objection and myths for small companies and startups where they need to figure out how to do more with their IP. In topic number 2, we're going to be looking at being sophisticated like a big company, but on a workable budget. In topic number 3, we're going to talk about the perception of value in IP. Extremely important to get this right before we delve into even thinking about an IP strategy. In topic number 4, we'll talk about something really important to startups, how IP and investors work together so you can leverage it. We'll talk about, in topic number 5, IP and customers. More than investors, early stage companies would really benefit to get to customers first and have lots of leverage. And finally, we'll cover some of the other things that IP overlaps to, other members of the value chain of startups, people in the startups, etc. So I chose these 6 different topics so that we could look at it from different points of view. And once we do that, we'll then wrap up. You know, in thinking about the audience here, obviously, to me, I designed this podcast for early stage companies, which I've worked for hundreds and hundreds of them, maybe thousands. If you're a small company and you're wrestling whether you should spend some time and effort and money on IP strategy, this podcast is definitely for you. If you're an investor and you're vetting a company, well, this podcast may be for you because you might be able to refer this to the startup company, but it will give you the rationale for why an IP strategy might be very useful for the company you're going to invest in. Being a board member for many companies myself, this is also for board members because this briefer on what an IP strategy is for small companies could be very useful for a board to basically recommend or to okay the use of others to help an IP strategy come about. Another area for the audience is for those who want to leverage their customers, partners, and value chain. A lot of startup companies don't know that they can leverage their value chain using IP. And finally, when I think about the audience, it's for those that may be starting their journey with an IP strategy. Hopefully this podcast will reassure you, but also it might give you some different ideas of some of the things that could be in your IP strategy. So coming up, we're going to be talking about objections and myths for small businesses and startups. We're going to discuss cost and benefits and how we can influence others in our evaluation. We're going to evaluate and then elaborate on how legal counsels work to elaborate the IP strategy. We'll even discuss how small businesses can emulate sophisticated large companies on a budget, shifting from mere patent counts to meaningful IP stories, using diverse monetization strategies, leveraging IP for risk management, product development, or supplier control. And we're also going to discuss enhancing capital access through strategic use of IP, where positioning IP is really key for businesses. So stay tuned. Well, let's jump right in. Objections and myths for small companies or startups who want to do more with their IP, should they or not? I think I must spend 2 or 3 phone calls a day for many weeks of many years on this one subject. So I think I'm well versed in talking to CEOs and investors and anybody involved in startups about, is doing IP work too expensive? Well, I could tell you, if you don't do good IP work, that this is going to be very expensive if you get it wrong. You lose your rights to patents. An employee takes your IP. You don't get invested in. You don't get a high valuation. So there's many reasons on the value side. But you know, when you look at the cost, I mean, you're probably talking to get started, maybe in the several thousands of dollars a provisional might cost, $5, $6, $7,000 to do it right. A small IP strategy, a trade secret program, an extraction of IP. I mean, raising a small round of money from friends and family would justify spending some money on IP. And that money could be anywhere from 5 to 20, 30K US. So, it's really not that expensive for a startup to get their IP rights correct because it has so many benefits on the other side. Another objection that I get a lot is, I'm not even sure I have IP. Well, look, in today's day and age, with all the technology, it's the combination of various technologies that make you innovative and novel and can get patents or want to protect trade secrets. I can tell you that in almost every company I've looked at, in the thousands, there's always some things that they're doing, which is very novel and new, that's very likely to be patentable or having trade secrets to protect. I've very rarely met a company that didn't have IP. So as a person who has almost 2,000 patents myself, I've worked with many clients over the years, I can tell you that it's extremely likely, high probability that you do have IP. So don't let that stop you from getting some expert advice. A third objection is, can IP help me with my investors? Look, if you go through the podcast of Invent Anything, I think we have 3 or 4 podcasts that talk about exactly this topic, how intellectual property can help leverage you to get investors in early and get a higher valuation for your company. Of course, it's like a bookshelf. There are some investors that on the left-hand side of the bookshelf don't care about IP. They think it's a cost. As you move to the middle of the bookshelf, there's some investors just care about risk, so they want you to do free and operate studies and so on, IP due diligence so they don't get sued. But as you move towards the right of the bookcase, there are many investors that see the many different ways that IP can attract value. One of the biggest ways is if the company ever gets acquired, if your company ever gets acquired, generally it's 1 or 2x revenues in an M&A. But with IP, especially you get 10, 15, 20 patents over time, you could go to 5x, 10x, 20x in valuation or more. We've seen it even hundreds. So certainly IP can help with investors. Another objection and myth is, can IP really work to stop others from stealing my ideas? I think this is a really good point. I think when you get a provisional, you can say patent pending, and that's going to steer some people away. It's like a stop sign, don't copy me. You'll never know who that is, but if you don't do it, you won't have it working for you. So certainly some low-cost provisionals and patent pending allows you to keep some competitors away. I can tell you that one great way to stop others from stealing your ideas is at the customer level. When you pitch to the customers that you have IP, they're going to be the ones that are going to judge whether or not they're going to buy your service or product or not. And if they believe that you have strong IP, they're very likely to buy you versus someone else. So the answer is, in almost all times, IP can certainly help others, help your company from having something to steal. Even your employees, some employees may walk out thinking that they can do this. If they know you file the patents or file the provisionals, they're less likely to do it. So I would say the maxim would be just assume that IP is going to help. Of course, there are stories where it hasn't, I know, but just assume it. A fifth area for objections and myths is what you don't know can hurt you. And this is the reason for the podcast. You might not know some of the things that intellectual property can help you with in your business, with managing employees, in margins for products, etc. And that certainly will hurt you. To kind of put a blind eye towards IP probably is not a good thing from a value standpoint of the company. Now, if you go to the Invent Anything website in IP Capital Group, there's about 50 podcasts now. These are designed for CEOs and CTOs and founders and investors for early stage companies. So you can literally get a free education by going through some of these podcasts. To answer the question, is what I know, what I don't know going to hurt me? My view is it probably will. Another objection and myth is, I won't have the time to do this. I'm so busy. I totally get it. I totally get that. As I've told many people, my kids growing up, there's things that are urgent and things that are not urgent, and things that are important and things that are non-important. And in one of those crosses, working on things that are important but non-urgent is where very few people spend time. But it turns out that if you spend time there, you can produce a lot of value. Generally, 5% of the time you spend are on those things that are important and non-urgent. And I would put intellectual property pretty close in that bucket until it becomes urgent where you're going to miss dates. So basically, I would say that you've got to make the time. It's not a lot, particularly if you bring in some other experts and get leverage, but I think you should make the time. Another objection is the business doesn't need IP. Well, there's a podcast directly on this. Does my business need IP? But I could short circuit that podcast by saying, you know, you could have patentable inventions, trade secrets, publications to stop others from patenting on top of you. You could have IP that could be the difference between whether you get investment or not. You could have IP defined which would stop somebody from your company from stealing from you. You can have IP that is the one thing that actually allows you to sell your product, convincing somebody else. You can have IP that allows your marketing group to tout that you're the innovator. You can have IP that's used, in almost every situation to raise value in your company. And one of the podcasts we have is IP a startup? Where we systematically take a column that's called startup and a column which is IP, and we look as rows all the things that are important to, say, a startup company. And IP patents help each one of those. So certainly the business does need IP. I can prove it. Take a listen to that podcast. Another objection to myth is, I already have a patent attorney. Isn't that enough? Now, I got to say, I'm not a patent attorney. I have patent attorneys and agents that work for me. But I'm an inventor with lots of patents, and I'm not a patent attorney. I chose not to get involved to become patent counsel early on in my career. Almost every company we work with has patent attorneys. They look at the perspective of intellectual property from the legal basis. And there's nothing wrong with patent attorneys. Most of my friends are patent attorneys. But I can tell you that patent attorneys look through the lens of legality. Generally, less of them look through the lens of business. Far less of them look through the lens of how to develop a market. Far less of them think about intellectual properties, how to raise money. Far less of them think about how it can affect business operations. So IP certainly can affect your business, but it's important to have a patent attorney on board. But there are so many other things that intellectual property can bring that intellectual property, counsel don't really work on. And that's a subject for many of these podcasts. So please take a listen to that. Another objection is, does any of this impact the company's valuation? Straight up, yes. You can go to valuations of 20x, 30x, 50x, 100x. It becomes one of the main differentiators in an M&A valuation. By the way, you can get a patent on something where your market's very small, but the market that's built by giants around that patent could be very large. So you could be getting royalty rates of 2, 3, 5% on billions of dollars, even though your own business would not have a revenue of more than 5 million. So think about that. It certainly can impact company valuation. Here's the last objection to myth, but it's really not the last objection to myth. There's many. So, which I said 2 to 3 times a day, I'm on the phone talking to early stage companies. What I hear is, look, isn't this IP strategy overkill? I could tell you that I think that's a very good observation of a very shrewd CEO. If you're thinking that an IP strategy is some sort of document that's 50 pages and it's something that you can't execute, I totally get that. An IP strategy in that case certainly is overkill. Sometimes an IP strategy could be as simple as get these 2 inventions, invent around this other invention, and do a free to operate study. Sometimes an IP strategy is forget about patents, lock in the trade secrets. IP strategy could just be at one tactic level. It doesn't have to be all of this. But the problem is, in order to figure out that one tactic, you've got to go through some thinking about IP strategy. So certainly IP strategy is an overkill. Think about it as, when you go to the doctor, there may be something wrong. You talk to your family practitioner, then you go to an expert. The expert then may run a few tests, and one test basically says, this is what's wrong, and luckily this is totally fixable. So the idea of an IP strategy is like that. You've got to go through some work to figure out what the thing is that allows you to have a really formidable IP strategy. Now, from this point, these objection of myths, let's go to topic number 2. Looking and being like a large company, but on a workable budget. First of all, you're a startup. Why would you want to look like a large company? Well, the answer is that when you look at startups, and you look at investors, they're not looking at the startup as just 2 or 3 people. They would like the company to be a larger company, right? Be more successful. As a matter of fact, some startups actually hire very senior people who have managed large companies with the specific intent to have that person help that small company look large. Intellectual property is very interesting because a patent gives you the right, as just a small company, to sit across the table on a deal and have the power of the US government or whatever the patent office is behind you, because patents give you the right to stop others from making, using, or selling your invention. And with the good patents, you have a great position to look like a large company. Even more importantly, with great trade secrets, if they can't figure out what you're doing and you know what your trade secrets are and you're hiding them, people will want to know your secret and you won't tell them the secret. So the combination of patents and trade secrets is even better. So this idea of being like a large, sophisticated company is a good one. There are 3 legs of the stool of IP. One is patents, one is trade secrets, one enabled publication. I ask you to take a look at the podcast on enabled publication in our library of podcasts. If you do that, what you'll find is this allows you to create an invention and publish it so nobody else can get a patent on it. This is important because it's cheap and fast to do, and so nobody can knock you out of your space. But then you'll be competing on market and the product delivery and stuff like that. So there's 3 legs of the stool, but being sophisticated like a large company, trade secrets and enabled publications should also come up. One of the things about large companies is they certainly always deliver a message in a story that people can understand, because they have marketing people and they have all sorts of help to really thoroughly explain what they're doing and why. For small companies with intellectual property, what we've found, and we have a number of services around this, is you can develop a very unique IP story. So with very small amounts of time and effort and dollars, you can create an IP story for your IP. So please take a look at that podcast on what is an IP story and how to do it. You can also look sophisticated by understanding the dollars and cents of your intellectual property. Large companies, have lots of patents, but they also have lots of revenue. So generating revenue is what a large company is all about. And they want the patents and the trade secrets to back up those large revenues. So there's this kind of, expectation that if you got lots of revenues, you're going to have lots of patents. When you're a small company, you don't have lots of revenue, but you might have some patents, but you might not recognize, but you could do a patent valuation for how valuable the patent could be if you monetize it for licensing or selling. So you can look sophisticated by talking like a large company because you could get a valuation of your IP so you know how valuable it is. And sometimes that number may be very surprising to you. It could be in the tens to hundreds of millions, even though you're making $500,000 in revenue. So you could look sophisticated like a large IP company. And please go to the podcast on how to do a patent valuation and you'll see what I'm talking about. Another thing you can do to look sophisticated is you could have multiple monetization paths, not just litigation. A lot of early stage companies I talk to think about their patents to be litigation grade, and I get it, and that makes sense. But there are 6 ways to make money. You can use it for license. You can use it for brand. You can use it for doing deals and transactions. You can use it for stock price, etc. Take a look at our podcast on the 6 ways of making money, and I think you might agree that there's many other ways to add value. One of the other things to look sophisticated is large companies do a lot to mitigate risk. But with the simple free to operate, you can literally reduce risk in your company to have a probability of knowing whether you can be sued by somebody else. So take a look at our podcast on free to operate. You'll actually probably come to the idea that maybe for some small amount of money, you might want to get a free to operate opinion on your product to reduce risk. Another thing to look sophisticated is to speed up product development. One of the things we've recognized over the years is if you develop a prototype, that's the precursor for the plan for a prototype. So please check out the most recent podcast on how provisionals act as prototypes. You can also look sophisticated by using patent pending and other markings. When you file a provisional, you can then put it on your website, it's patent pending. A lot of small companies don't know that. So that makes you look sophisticated by having products that are tagged with patent pending. So another thing we can do to look sophisticated is leveraging your sales and marketing. And we talked about patent pending, but talking about your intellectual property, your creativity, innovation in marketing and sales is always important when the market would respond to innovation. And it certainly does. The rate of speed of innovation is very high and customers expect innovation. So intellectual property is king in talking about your innovation. And the last thing to look sophisticated is it's really helps with access to capital. So one of the things that large companies do is they have access to capital markets through being public companies. Even though you're not a public company, likely, you have access to capital markets through being able to leverage your intellectual property to raise money, through investments in equities, asset-based loans on patents, etc. So you can look sophisticated using intellectual property to enhance your access to capital. So coming up, we're going to get into two new topics. One is the perception of value of IP and how patents can help you enhance M&A valuation, influence contracts, bolster balance sheets, added strategies for leveraging IP for negotiations with competitors. And then we'll move into talking about IP and investors, where we'll cover how intellectual property can be integral in discussions with investors, from enhancing your business plan, reducing your risk, serving as a barrier for entry. And we'll also examine the role of IP and its valuation, and how even at board meetings or securing funding, how it's pivotal in driving that decision. So stay tuned. So in topic number 3, let's talk about the perception of value in IP. Now, I have to admit, I've been involved in intellectual property since about 1985 or so. And as a practicing inventor, I believed in IP, getting patents and claims and so on. I looked at it as something that stopped competitors. The more I worked on things, I looked at it as something that could be leveraged in a litigation. The more I started doing business at IP Capital, I started seeing it have leverage with smaller businesses, big businesses. And after having done many transactions with intellectual property, hundreds of licenses and hundreds of companies and raising money, I came to the opinion that intellectual property has a perceived value. Yeah, winning a litigation and getting a check is real value. Yeah, selling a patent and getting a check is real value. Yeah, winning a licensing agreement and getting a royalty check every quarter is real value. I get that. But so many times you see intellectual property silently moving the business forward by helping it raise money, by doing a deal, by winning a customer. And I started to recognize, boy, the perceived value of intellectual property is very high. Look, there's 11, 12 million patents, okay? There's 2,000 or 3,000 litigations a year in the US. So the number of litigations doesn't even come close to the number of what patents are. How many patents are actually licensed or sold? It's very small. So why the heck is everybody getting all these patents? It's because of the other thing it does, which is the perceived value. So let's get into that. One of the things is that there's certainly a perceived value with numbers. So if you have one patent, that's good. If you have 2, that's better. But as you get to 10 or 20 patents or provisionals, what happens is there's a hockey stick in the value when you kind of look at M&A versus number of patents. So the perceived value is that numbers help. I can tell you the reason I think that is, well, when we work with large companies and help them do invent rounds of patents that they're worried about, basically, if we invent around the patent, that's good for the large company that's hired us to do that. Invent around, by the way, is one of our podcasts and one of our services. However, if you invent around a patent and the portfolio of the company has multiple patents and you land on that, then you have to invent around a second patent and a third patent and a fourth patent. So it tends to be much harder to invent around 10, 15, 20 patents than one, which is probably why the M&A value is related to it. So that hockey stick value is very important. Another thing about the perceived value is, granting a patent license to sell the product is a really unique idea. It says that if I build a pen with an ink cartridge and I sell it, I can't turn around and then sue you for my patent on the ink cartridge. On the other hand, if I patent my pen with my ink cartridge, and I have a patent on it, but I just sell the pen, and I never bring up the fact that I have the patent, I'm not leveraging my IP in the transaction. I'm selling it for a price. However, it's very easy to talk about that you have a patent on this in the product and putting it on the packaging, so that in essence, they're seeing that they're buying that innovation. So you're getting a perceived value by having patents. So when I'm looking at, say, a company like Amazon, I'm trying to buy a product, some of these companies list their patents or say they have patent pending, and there's a perceived value to that. One of the things that some people won't do is they won't buy knockoff products because they think that that's dishonest. A patent says this is not a knockoff. So there's a lot of perceived value there. Another thing is that there's a lot of perception of value when you can use your IP in negotiating contracts. Certainly you have NDAs, but when you have contracts, between you and a supplier or you and a customer, you can add your IP language to it that says by doing this contract, the intellectual property that we have is licensed in this deal. Now that means you mentioned the intellectual property in the contract, which then means you've given it value. And later on, you can then negotiate another contract and say, we were able to do the last contract because we had the IP. So now you're adding more value to the perception of the value of IP. One of the key ways of using intellectual property and getting a perception of value is with new employees. Come to our business, work for us, meet the CTO. He's the inventor of, our business officer has patents on this, and our CEO has, two key patents in the industry from a previous business. So come to our business, invent with us. That's a very different pitch than come to our business because we're going to give you a salary and this is the sort of things you're going to work on. In other words, the perception of invention through the use of patents and trade secrets in hiring people is a huge deal. Another thing you could do is leverage the value of trade secrets. I don't know how many companies miss this, and this is big and small. They don't know what their trade secrets are. They don't have a trade secret registry. They never leverage the fact that in negotiations or with other folks that they have trade secrets. Take a look at the podcast on what is a trade secret and how to protect it. You'll be very surprised how low cost it is and how easy it is to do, but you have to transverse understanding what it is and do a little bit of work. One of the neat ways of adding the perceived value to a business is adding it to the balance sheet. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to add numbers to the balance sheet for your IP. That would be the wrong thing to do because you don't want to have patents on your balance sheet that basically has a number on it because you ever try to use the patent for litigation, that is subpoenable, and you would find out that that would be the value that you would expect to win in the litigation, some pro rata percentage of it because you define the value. What I'm saying is that when the CFO is talking to the board after he's done with the balance sheet, he basically then talks about these assets that we have. We have 18 patents issued and 3 filed and 18 trade secrets defined. It's our asset, and confidentially, we're not disclosing the value of it. Confidentially, though, at the board, you might discuss the value, but it's not a written down number. One of the things is there's another perception of value because many times there's a perceived value to IP in doing a transaction. I literally sat at a negotiation between a CEO and a company that was going to buy them. And they had already set the price and they discussed a bunch of things. The CEO brought up some of the new patents that issued, and somebody asked the question, is that going to change our discussion of how much to buy it? He took out a notepad and took one sheet from it. He wrote down a number. He wrote down something, folded it up, slid it across the table to the company that's going to buy his company. Everybody was silent. All of a sudden, he opened it up. He looked at it, and you saw this guy, the buyer, nod. Yes. Basically, that little note stayed on the table. All the people on our side of the table were wondering what the heck the CEO did. Everybody stood up, shook hands, they left. We all came back. The CEO picked up his little paper and put it in his pocket. And we're all asking, what's going on? He says, we just sold the company for 3 times what I thought we could do. Because he believed in his IP. That's a real story. Now, I'm not sure the CEO made up that number or not, because I never followed up at the end, because it took many, many, many months to close the deal. It was just one of my clients, but the perceived value of IP was tremendous. One of the things about the perceived value is to keep track of IP deals in your space. If companies are selling for 20x revenue because they have IP, that's good to know. If companies are pulling down really good transactions to customers because of IP, that's good to know. So keep track of the IP, and you'll see the perceived value kind of pop up. One of the last things about the perceived value is you might not sort of know this until you maybe listen to our podcast on the IP scan. But when you can extract inventions and put it in a list, that list by itself is intellectual property, and you can leverage that list by doing all sorts of things, by raising money based upon the fact that you have a real list of potential inventions, and you need the money to essentially get these things filed. So there's a perceived value in even the list of ideas before you get the IP. I think that's really cool. So let's go to the fourth topic, IP and investors. This is a great place to raise value. We talked about it, the perception of value, of course, in the previous topic, but let's hit it. If we talk about IP investors, getting to know your investor is important. Talking about IP as you're getting to know the investor is important because you can see if there's any value in it. Before you even have discussions about your business plan or whatever in the very high level meeting, throw out that you have intellectual property and you're very proud of it and see what they say. They could say, well, look, I've done plenty of deals and intellectual property hasn't done anything for me. So you would just know that, right? If you, on the other hand, said, we have we have IP and we're very proud of it. He says, I think that's great. I love companies with good IP. Now you can hit on that in your business plan. So IP and investors, know your investor first. A second thing with IP and investors is adding intellectual property to the business plan. Find ways to show the value. Find ways to show the patent valuation, how you can maybe monetize the IP through licensing or sales of selling some patents if you don't need them. Add an IP story. I mentioned the podcast here on IP stories, but really add intellectual property to your business plan. Just don't simply list patent numbers at the end. That's about the weakest thing you could do with intellectual property. Develop an IP story. A third thing we can do is add IP for investors as a risk profile. Tout the fact that since you have provisionals or patents, you've looked at the art, and therefore it's very likely you're going to get sued by competitors because you've analyzed that. Talk about the fact that if someone traverses in your space, you have IP that you can push against competitors to kick them out of the market or at least do better deals. Talk about the fact how you're lowering your risk in the market for acquisition because IP should help you get acquired. There's so many ways that IP can help you lower risk. Talk to the investor about that. One of the key things about IP to investors is a barrier for entry. They're always asking for barrier for entry, right? Are you going to get there faster? Is your product going to be 10% better? Is there some business model you've got to essentially make it better? Add barriers for entry with intellectual property. The whole idea of intellectual property is to stop somebody else from making, using, or selling if it's a patent, or for a trade secret to not figure it out. So add your barrier for entry. Make it a slide. Talk about it in your business plan. We can also take IP for investors and talk about how you can leverage valuation. Here's a tip, hard one. Use this for many years with many CEOs, that if they came to me and said, we've already got an investor interested, they're doing valuation, they've already valued our company, but we'd like to get our patents in place, and even the investor says, we need to get the IP in place. That's good news, but you'll never be able to change the valuation once they've said it. So you can't use IP to raise the valuation if you've already gotten the valuation from the investor. The reason why this is a really important tip is if you're listening to this and you're about to talk about valuation, stop. Get an understanding of the valuation for IP first, and then bring it into the deal. That's how you raise the valuation. Get a valuation without talking about IP, you will never change it. That's just real world experience. In the next part here, IP investors, well, I was just doing this yesterday with a company that had a platform technology. They have so many inventions that it was very clear that to any investor, they would not be considered as valuable because they had no focus. They had a platform that could do so many things with it. So what we had recognized was their company had shifted from a product with the platform to an IP company with the platform, where one of the products would be first. So think about IP holding companies. If you're a platform company, investors would understand that. There'll be more on IP holding companies later in the series. We'll be doing one specifically on IP holding companies in the near future. Another thing about IP investors is leveraging it for the valuation steps. When you're going through a new round, having IP is going to help with valuation, as we mentioned. Interestingly enough, if you have another round coming up, you can build more IP just for that round. Now, one of the things is that some companies raise money and they're raising it, $500,000 in 1 month, and maybe 8 months from now raising another $500,000 or $1 million. Well, you need something substantial to go from one round to the next as the reason for raising valuation. So the whole idea of generating more patents in those 6 months would be the reason for raising the valuation. Another thing we can do is leverage IP at the board, which we mentioned. Investors will be on the board. Talking about your IP at the board meetings is always important because it's raising value in their mind. And then finally, adding intellectual property as a use of funds. Very rarely would an investor disagree with that you want another 100K, 150K, whatever, to get some more patents in place, to put your trade secret program in place, reduce risk. Now is the time to add intellectual property for your use of funds. So coming up, we're going to learn two things. We're going to learn how intellectual property can enhance customer relationships and help drive our business strategy. We'll examine the role of IP in sales, price negotiation, securing exclusive rights, supporting JVs, and everything that has to do with that. We'll also look at how IP impacts the many other players in the situations of a startup, how it can resolve internal conflicts, aid in valuation, contribute to revitalizing the business, even help with CEOs to help them tell the story. So stay tuned. So let's move to topic number 5, intellectual property and customers. We've talked about this a few times at a few hit points, but let's go through some different ones. One of the things is that when you're doing sales and marketing, it's really important to showcase your innovation, which means it's important to showcase your IP. Now, sometimes talking about your IP as a patent number is somewhat useful, but talking about what the invention is even better. Sometimes it's important to have a quick interview with the inventor, make a video of it. Sometimes it's important to showcase even the claims of some of your patents in sales and marketing. Obviously, patent pending on sales and marketing helps, but it's important to really do a good job of what your patents actually cover and why they're important to the product or service. One of the things that customers tend to do with intellectual property, if they hear you've got it, it kind of puts them on notice not to shop you around, meaning to go find somebody else that has an identical product or service. So that's why it's vital to mention intellectual property in sales. One of the things is that when you talk about intellectual property in your sales, you should recognize that the patent office granted the patent, which means they believe it's novel, and they have no dog in the fight. They did it based upon looking at the prior art. So you can rely on the fact that the patent office is not an investor, doesn't care about your company at all. They say it's novel. So use that positioning with your customers. In several studies, it's been shown that if products are backed up with patents, then the margins of those products are higher than those products that aren't backed up with patents. And the numbers sometimes thrown around is about a 34% enhancement in margins. So it's important to recognize that patents can improve your margins, and that's an invisible thing, meaning you can get a higher price by having patents and not even know it's your patents that are doing that. Because somewhere in the market, someone is buying your product because it's a patent, it's innovation. Somewhere in the market, they're not buying the competitor's product because you have the patent, whatever. Somewhere in the market, your patent is basically stopping someone from entering the market. This is all invisible stuff. You'll never see it, but it certainly can help you. So think about that you should be expecting higher margins. So if your product or services are the exact same price as somebody else's product or service, and you have the patents, you are doing something wrong. Another thing that you can do is you can use IP with customers and ensure the customers don't patent on top of you. Meaning, if you have patents on your product or service, your customer can't look at that product or service and then start patenting it or patent minor improvements on it because you'll be prior art to them. So by understanding your patents and making sure your customers understand it, and also watching your customers so they don't patent on top of you, this will be a major deal. So some companies, when they buy your product or service, will integrate it into theirs, and then they'll create intellectual property on top of you. So please watch the podcast on Invent Around and make sure that nobody's inventing on top of you. One of the things about intellectual property and customers is patents are a great way to show the documentation of how something works. So someone could be reviewing technically your product, and you could forward your patents to them because there's a description of how the invention works. And two things are happening. They're getting a really detailed discussion as to how your product works or product component, but they're also now subliminally know you own it. So use intellectual property as technical documentation. Another thing you can use intellectual property for with customers is connecting your IP to the customer. And what I mean by this is to literally take a look at the customer's use of your patents or the customer's use of your product or service, and literally show how that connection where your inventions and your product or service is connecting into the customers is a strong connection, and show that your patent is, in essence, that connection. And by doing this, you've shown the real relevance of your patent. So if I have lids and I'm making lids for cups, and the customer has cups and they're making cups to sell, and they aggregate your lids to the cups, and their rim around the cup is a special, angle that they've devised, and you developed your molding for your plastic lid to be exactly that, and you have a patent maybe around that special lip for their special cup, your patent protects the way that your lid works with their cup. Simplified example, I know, but if you get to more detailed technology, you'll recognize that this always works. One of the things about using intellectual property with customers is if a customer continues to work with you and buy more and more volume, maybe it comes up they want to do a joint venture. What a great, terrific use for intellectual property, because it's going to define clearly what you own and what you don't own, and it helps them understand that. Another thing you could do with IP and customers is to do free to operate, so you know you can't get sued by your customer, because sometimes you have a product or service where they might own the patents and you're selling something and they can leverage it against you. Also, you can do evidence of use to find out if there are any of your product components out there that has somebody else's patents on it. That would be free to operate. But then you could go the other way to see if your patents relate to the product elements of a competitor, and that's evidence of use. So using free to operate or evidence of use is an important tool in understanding your position with your customers. And by the way, there are podcasts of both evidence of use and free to operate that you could take a look at. And the last thing we'll talk about IP and customers is the use as a holding place. Intellectual property as filed as a provisional is a great quick way of taking ownership. You have a discussion with the client, the customer. You recognize that that could be an invention. You come back home and you write a provisional, get it filed right away, keep it under your NDA, but now you own that invention. So having provisionals that are filed continually start to give you an ownership in the conversation you're having relative to the enhancements you're making to your products with the customer. Don't walk out talking about enhancements to your product to the customer, well, without walking home and thinking that maybe I should file a provisional on that. Else you've just sort of given it away. Now let's look at the final topic, IP and others. One of the things that you can do with intellectual property is resolve all sorts of conflicts that you could have with your own founders and your own people. So take a look at the poison pill episode in number 43, our episode Invent Anything, and you'll recognize how important this is. Since I've put this podcast out, I've referred this podcast so many times to so many clients because I recognize they're treading in a danger zone of not getting their intellectual property right, falling into the poison pill trap. And I've been told that some of the people that have listened to this episode were absolutely shocked by what was involved by not doing it. It sort of frightened them, I guess, into making sure they did their intellectual property right. One of the things that IP relates to other things about a startup is a patent is a startup in that sense. So take a look at episode 46 where we list all the things of a startup, all the things of a patent, and we compare. And you'll get convinced that you could have a patent that becomes a startup. Or if you have a startup, the patent can overlap and help with many things of the startup or many patents. Another thing is that the CFO comes to play. We've mentioned a couple times how intellectual property can play at the balance sheet. You should take a look at episode number 42 on patent valuation to really get a grounding on that, on how intellectual property can help with valuation, which means that our CFO now has a real tool to use in their startup. Another thing you can recognize very quickly is if you have patents as a startup, a lot of startups don't work. And that happens for many reasons. I think 90% of the startups fail, right? If you have patents, you may find that you can sell the patents and get $250,000, $500,000, $1 million, $2 million out of selling your portfolio. So sometimes you have to exit out of a business, but if you have to, the patents become the sole way to actually exit out with making some money on the way out. Now, of course, you could sell your technology and sell the pieces. Patents will certainly help it. So consider that as a down risk on the investment. One of the things is that intellectual property can be used in so many things. If you go to episodes 34 and 35, which is to how to use intellectual property to revitalize your business, what you can recognize, intellectual property can help with morale, boosting sales, strengthening your brand, fostering innovation, enhancing business relationships. You can get tips in these episodes on how to do all these things. And therefore, intellectual property can literally come in and refresh a business, revitalize it. One of the things about intellectual property is it overlaps with technical teams. We mentioned that when you're doing a prototype to make something work, you could actually easily write the provisional from the prototype. On the other hand, the provisional could be the prototype. So listen to episode number 39 and how a provisional, becomes the prototype process to first level. And we work with a lot of clients to create provisionals and then help them with the prototype. So that synergy is very important. Take a look at that. One of the things about technical teams as well is when they're developing their technology, they should take a look at what is out there in terms of others' patents. Because maybe they need to invent around patents of others to be free and clear of their new enhancement. So episode number 28 talks about how to invent around patents. One of the things about the help of intellectual property for other things related to startups is for copycats. Take a look at our episode number 37 on how to stop copycats using IP. If you're in marketing, you need to listen to that because you're out there all the time competing with competitors. Having intellectual property in a startup company is one of the key things to help you as a business tool to stop copycats. One of the other things about startups is business auditing. You can actually use intellectual property as a way to help understand the value in your business. Episode 26 talks about, does your business need IP? And certainly in the audit process, it can show the many different ways it can help the value of your business. And finally, if you're the CEO of a startup and you're considering IP or have IP, please, 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 please understand how you can tell the story of your IP. To have IP and not telling the story is just unconscionable, in my opinion, because so many people get IP and just leave it on the table as if it's just numbers on a sheet. You're spending a lot of money on intellectual property, generally, when you do it. Now, even though we talked about the myths here, that doesn't cost that much. And when you start filing patents, as you start raising money, then it does start costing money. So listing a patent number is not going to help anybody, really, to sell the value. Telling your story of where it fits in the competitive landscape, what your claims are about, why it's strong, why it helps you with 6 different ways of making money, etc. These are all things that can help you tell the story. Well, look, let's wrap up. In topic number 1, we talked about objections and myths for small companies or startups, and with the idea of considering maybe doing more with IP. We discussed a whole bunch of things, like reservations of why you should invest in intellectual property. We address concerns such as the perceived high costs, its actual necessity, and its potential to protect ideas from being stolen. We talked about whether the IP can attract investors. We talked if it can significantly impact valuation. We even talked about things like how to have patent attorneys and how to deal with them, and whether you need a patent attorney or more. We talked about strategies, how you can use to impact the common objections of the business. We even tried to demystify IP to show that it has value, even for small entities. And we try to debunk some of these myths to show how benefits of strategic importance to IP management. So, yeah, there are objections to myths, but we mentioned 10, and there are many more. We talked about in topic number 2, how to look and be sophisticated like a big company using IP, and how to do that on a budget. We explored how small companies can effectively manage intellectual property to appear to be as robust as a strategic large company without exceeding budgets. We discuss all these strategies of utilizing patents and trade secrets and publications, the 3 legs of the stool. And we move beyond that from just counting patents to tell a compelling IP story to emphasize value. We talked about how to emphasize practical valuation tactics to explore the many ways that patents can be, or trade secrets can be monetized. We even talked about free and operate to reduce risk. We talked about how provisional patents are useful, particularly as you're developing prototypes. They could be the prototype. We also talked about tactics like how you can control suppliers and customers, and how to leverage it in marketing. We even talked about how intellectual property can help gain access to markets, to like asset-based loans and things like that. So there's a lot of ways to use intellectual property in a startup to act like a strategic big company. In topic number 3, I talked about my history of how I went from being an inventor of patents for everything from recognition to stopping copycats to, as I started to run my firm IP Capital, to dealing with thousands of companies, where I came away recognizing that the perceived value of IP is as valuable, if not more valuable, than the real value of IP. We talked about how business value is improved with IP across various factors. We talked about how patent pendings is important, but having 1 versus 2 versus 3 versus even 10 or 15 improves valuation. We talked about that hockey stick growth. We talked about how you can maximize the sale of products with your IP. We talked about how you can leverage IP in contracts with suppliers and customers. We even highlighted how IP can be used in employee engagements for new hiring, how to sell the power of your innovation in your company. We also talked about how trade secrets are critical and how they're one of the best intellectual property forms from a cost to value. We also talked about the significance of IP on the balance sheet and how to use that in board meetings. And we also talked about how to have this track record of converting your provisionals to patents, and how you can then leverage more provisionals where you know the track record will get you the patents. Look, there's just so many ways to handle the perceived value of IP. In topic number 4, we move from that conversation to let's actually talk about our investor, because startups need investors. So we discussed and explored strategic role of intellectual property in attracting investors. We discussed how startups can utilize IP to make strong first impressions. We talked about how you can incorporate it into your business plans. We talked about how you can facilitate licensing deals to raise value. We talked about how IP can lower the risk, how it can create barriers for entry. We talked about those critical factors, how we can leverage it for enhancing business valuation. We talked about how IP can be used in investor communication to showcase your innovation. We even talked about how to use this to influence board meetings, and how it's not just a legal asset, but also it's a component of your strategic plan. It's a component of your marketing and product direction, and a component of your sales. All that is something that you can communicate to your investors. So certainly startups can use IP and help it leverage their investors. Once we got the business going and investors are bought on, now you're dealing with another important client, and that's called the customers. So we talked about how IP related to customers. We talked about how it drove your business, how it can help attract customers through sales and marketing, things like patent pending. We talked about how you can use it to help decision-making at the customer level. We talked about making sure that maybe the patent office becomes a third-party validation of your novelty. We talked about how IP can prevent competitors from sort of patenting on top of you. Or we also talked about how there's improved margins with the patent-protected products, 34%. We talked about how you can use IP to clarify in technical documentation. And we also talked about how you can strengthen your connection to the customer by showing how your IP connects directly to their cup with your lid. We talked about risk and freedom to operate and evidence of use, so you can maintain competitive advantage. So once we've got the investment and once we've got the customers, the other thing is to recognize all the other things that IP can do around your business. We talked about all the different podcasts we had that could affect inventorship and ownership, like the poison pill. We talked about implications financially of the CFO, valuations, etc. We talked about how you can boost morale and use it for sales and strengthen brand. We talked about how technical teams can use this for prototyping. We talked about how marketing teams can use this for selling. We talked about, how to combat copycats. We even talked about how business auditing can be improved through the use of IP. And finally, we ended up by talking about CEOs to tell CEOs, if you're not using an IP story and you have IP, you're really not getting the value from your IP. As a matter of fact, if you use an IP story to develop your IP, you can develop even more IP and a better story. It's a never-ending journey. So please take a look at that podcast. So we had fun with going through these 6 topics of how IP strategy can be used for startups and all these different topics. We hope you liked it. If you like it, please subscribe and hit the like button. And please come and join our Invent Anything series of podcasts. It's a wonderful way for startup companies and early stage companies to get a great free education. And we're also, take a look at our inventors work link, because we're interviewing inventors all the time to try to talk about how they became an inventor and why. This is John Cronin, Invent Anything.